Finally, we come to the third and last question that determines the overall long-term profit potential of a resource. And that's the question of appropriation. Who gets to keep the profits that are generated by a resource? And the main point here is that the profit that a resource generates doesn't always go to the owner of the resource. And you might find that to be a bit counterintuitive. You might think, well, if I own the resource, then I ought to be able to get the profits that that resource generates. But it's not always that way. And we're going to talk about a few of the conditions that determine who gets to keep the profits that are generated by a resource. One of those conditions is mobility. And here the question is, how difficult is it to move the resource between firms? Is the resource embedded in a particular firm's culture and processes and systems and therefore very difficult to move between firms? Or is the resource embedded only in particular individuals who can be hired away? If the resource is embedded in the firm's overall culture and processes and systems, then it's much less mobile, and therefore the firm is much more likely to be able to appropriate the profits that the resource generates. On the other hand, if the resource is embedded only in particular individuals who can be hired away, not in the overall system and processes and culture of the firm, then it's more likely that those individuals will be able to appropriate the profits that are generated by the resource. Another factor to bear in mind is that ownership is often unclear. Who owns a resource? Sometimes difficult to tell. For example, who owns the client relationship in a professional services firm, such as an accounting firm or an advertising agency or a law firm or a consulting firm or an investment bank? Who owns the client relationship? Is that relationship owned by the individual professional, or is it owned by the firm? And the answer to this question will vary across professions. In some professions, it may be owned by the professional. In some cases, it may be owned by the firm. But there's at least enough ambiguity there that it may be unclear who would appropriate the profits from that resource, from that relationship with the client. Also, attempts to resolve this issue through non-compete agreements often do not work because non-compete agreements are often unenforceable. You can try to get someone to sign a piece of paper that says that if they ever leave the firm, that they won't, take their client relationships with them, or they won't compete against the firm for those clients. But the reality is that in many jurisdictions, those sort of agreements are unenforceable. For example, the state of California is notorious for just not enforcing non-compete agreements. They have laws there that make it very difficult to enforce non-compete agreements in that state. And so this is something that can vary by jurisdiction. Another factor that can cloud the issue of who owns a resource is that sometimes resources are difficult to separate. For example, you may think of your skills as residing in you, right? That skills belong to you, the employee, as an employee. However, trade secrets belong to the firm. But where's the line between skill and trade secrets? How do you know when an employee leaves your firm whether what they're bringing with them, what assets they're bringing with them to their new employer represent their personal skills and experiences that they've developed over the years, or whether they represent trade secrets that actually belong to the firm? And this has been a contentious issue in many specific cases. For example, the departure of Ignacio Lopez from General Motors to Volkswagen. Ignacio Lopez ran the European operations for General Motors and then moved over to Volkswagen. And General Motors cried foul and argued basically that Ignacio Lopez was stealing trade secrets and bringing them to Volkswagen. And Lopez's response was, no, these are not trade secrets. This is just the experience and skills that I have built up as a person through my work for General Motors. And so it sometimes is difficult to separate out what's the experience and skill that ostensibly really belongs to the employee from the trade secrets that belong to the firm. Those are difficult and potentially contentious issues to work out where ownership is unclear, and that may make it difficult to figure out, who's actually going to appropriate the value of that resource, whether it's a skill or a trade secret. Finally, bargaining power may make ownership irrelevant in the following sense. Resources often don't work in isolation. They work in combination with other complementary resources. And so the question of who owns the other complementary resources can determine who has the bargaining power in the relationship. So, for example, think about firm-specific skills. Firm-specific skills can be a double-edged sword, right? As an employee, if you develop skills that are not firm-specific, then you can take those skills to a variety of different employers, and they'll be valued in the market, and there'll be a market for them. On the other hand, especially when you're trying to build a competitive advantage in a firm, what you're trying to do is do things differently. And therefore, you need to train your people to do things differently, to have a unique way of doing things that is different from all the other competitors in the industry, like Southwest Airlines does, versus the way things are done in the rest of the airline industry. And so in order to do things differently, you need your people to have firm-specific skills. And this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it makes the employer more dependent upon a particular set of employees, because those employees have made the investment in training and experience to learn how things are done in this particular company, to learn those firm-specific skills. But it also means that those same employees are more dependent upon that particular company, because all those firm-specific skills that they've invested in learning are skills that are not particularly useful to any other employer. And so they pose less of a threat if they threaten to leave and go somewhere else. All those skills that they've built up are not going to be that valuable to any other potential employer, and so those employees are less of a threat to actually leave. So in this case, it's a double-edged sword, and how that bargaining power balances out in the relationship, which basically becomes more or less a bilateral monopoly relationship with the firm-specific skills, depends upon how much each side has invested in developing those firm-specific skills and how much of a threat there is to replace those employees or replace the company on either side. Does the employee really have a viable, credible threat to move to a different company on the one hand, versus does the employer really have a viable, credible threat to replace that employee with other new employees, given that the company will have to then invest in developing the firm-specific skills of those new employees, which will not, for at least some period of time, be up to the level of firm-specific skills of the employee that they currently have. So how this balances out in bargaining power depends upon the relative credibility of those two threats. The employee's threat to leave and go to another employer, and the employer's threat to replace the employee with someone else from the outside.